Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me to talk about Alexander III of Macedonia, better known as Alexander the Great. My name is Jennifer Tobin. I'm professor of archaeology at the University of Illinois, and I'm here to talk about who I think is one of the most fascinating people of the ancient world. And we will today explore this fascinating man. We'll look at his career, his character, and what elements made him great. Now, I want to say that getting at him is a little difficult because although many biographies were written during his lifetime and shortly after his death, these are lost. There were some ancient biographies, but they were written several centuries after his death, after a time that Alexander's myth had already developed. So many stories we find about him are quite exaggerated. We simply need to comb through and try to understand the true elements of the story. What we do know is that at the age of 20, he entered with a vast army, the Persian Empire, and 13 years later, he had conquered that empire and had created one of his own. However, he wasn't able to enjoy this empire. At the age of 33, he was dead in Babylon. But the world he left behind was forever changed. He had brought Greek ideas to the east, and he brought Eastern ideas west. And so the subsequent centuries after his death was a period where we saw great developments in art, science, and literature. But today I really want to focus on the influences that drove him. And I like to think of this as angels and demons, the things that were good in his life and the things that drove him to perhaps less than ideal behaviors. And as we hear, he had incredible personal courage. He loved his troops, and his troops loved him back. He had respect for the talents of others, and he had an intense curiosity about the world. Countering that was his overweening desire for fame. He especially wanted to outdo his remarkable father, with whom he had a very uneasy relationship. Strangely, he had a growing belief in his own divinity, which is hard for us to accept, but was something that was very true to him. And we know that he abused alcohol. He may have been an alcoholic, and he may have died of alcohol poisoning. So these are some darker elements of his life. But let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin at his homeland, Macedonia, this mountainous region in northern Greece, fit in antiquity for sheep herding as it is today, as you can see from that photograph. Now, Macedonia to the Greeks was hardly even a Greek world. The Macedonians spoke a dialect of Greek that the Greeks couldn't understand. They had strange customs, such as drinking their wine undiluted with water. The Greeks always put water in their wine. And they had a king. And for Greeks in, say, the 5th century BC, most Greek city-states were governed by democracies or oligarchies. Kingship was sort of backward. And throughout its history, Macedonia kind of stepped out of important historical events. But this all changed in 359 BCE when Philip came to the throne. Now, Philip was the descendant of the Argead dynasty that had been ruling Macedonia for several centuries. Now, interestingly, this dynasty believed they were descended from the Greek hero Heracles. And this is something that many important families believed in. They believed that there had an ancestor in their deep past who was some sort of hero, in this case, Heracles. Now, when Philip came to the throne, Macedonia was a small area, not very important, but in 20 years, he expanded it, and by the time he died, he had conquered all of the Greek world. And of course, this is the man who is the father of Alexander the Great. And some people say, had Alexander not been born, Philip would have been called Philip the Great by us today. Now, how was he able to conquer? Well, he developed a remarkable style of fighting. he invented what we call sarissa warfare, where these sarissas, which are these enormously long spears, sometimes 15 feet long, they had a spear point on one end, a pointed butt on the other, and you can see that lines of soldiers would hold these enormous weapons before them, and no enemy could get in reach of them. Now, the only way that this could work is if the army was extremely well trained, where the men would walk in lockstep. Otherwise, it would be chaos. The spears would bump into each other. It would be not working at all. Philip trained his troops immaculately, and it's said that he was really the first to create a professional army. Well, nobody could stand against this army. You could imagine this wall of spears coming towards you. And so rapidly, Philip was able to conquer the surrounding territories. And as I said, eventually he conquered Greece itself. Now, Philip had another tool in his arsenal to create a powerful kingdom. And this was through diplomacy, chiefly through marriage alliances. Now, the Macedonian king was not limited to one wife. Polygamy was acceptable. And we know that Philip had at least 7 wives. Each of these women he married after he conquered various areas. The most important of these was a woman named Olympias, who was a princess of the region called Epirus, which is today roughly the equivalent of Albania. Now, Olympias's family believed they were descended from a hero, in this case, the hero Achilles, the great hero of the Trojan War, who was the sort of embodiment of the Greek warrior. Now, she was the mother of Alexander, and he therefore was descended, in his mind, both from the hero Heracles and from Achilles. Now, many stories exist about the childhood of Alexander, and I'll just share one with you, perhaps the most famous and certainly one of the most engaging, which is the story of Bucephalus. Now, I want to say right now, I'm going to try to show you images that are roughly contemporary with Alexander, but we don't have very many of these. So I'm supplementing them with more recent interpretations of these stories, recent being the medieval period and the 18th century in this case. So here we see the story of Alexander and Bucephalus. Bucephalus was this remarkably beautiful horse, high-spirited, and virtually untamable. Philip had acquired this horse, but had given up on it. He couldn't ride it, he couldn't break it, he couldn't tame it. Alexander at 10 took a look at the horse and promised his father that he could tame the horse. And Philip sort of sneered at him, but let him have a chance to try. Alexander led the horse towards the sun, leapt on its back, and the horse was putty in his hands. Evidently, the horse was afraid of his shadow, and so as he was aiming towards the sun, he wasn't troubled by his shadow. Now, I don't know if this is a true story. It's a story certainly that celebrates the cleverness of Alexander. It's also a story that hints at tension between father and son, and this is something we know existed throughout their lifetimes. Now, Alexander grew up being trained as a soldier, as a warrior. He learned to fight, use the spear, the bow, the sword. He could ride horseback, of course. He learned strategy. But he also was given the benefit of a remarkable education. The great philosopher Aristotle was invited to come and set up a school that would train Alexander and the sons of other Macedonian noblemen. And this school ran for about 3 years, and Alexander and his fellows were educated in philosophy, art, science. We know that Aristotle gave Alexander an important gift, gave him a copy of the Iliad, the great poem that tells the story of the Trojan War, where Achilles, Alexander's supposed ancestor, was such an important player. And Alexander carried this copy of the Iliad with him wherever he went throughout his entire lifetime. Alexander had to grow up fast, however. By the age of 16, 16, he was participating in battles. By the age of 18, he was leading the cavalry. And at the age of 18, he was king of Macedonia. And this came through a remarkable tragedy. Philip, his father, in 336 BC, was celebrating a wedding of his daughter at a place called Aigai. You can see where it is on the map. It's a small capital city of Macedon. And the wedding was taking place in the theater. You can see the partially excavated theater on the right. Philip entered the theater without a bodyguard, and there was a throng of guests and other people there. Out of the group, a man leapt with a knife and he murdered Philip. And then he was captured and killed himself. So we don't know what was the motivation of this man. There were many, many stories about some sort of revenge, of a love gone wrong. But the most interesting story, and one that scholars do entertain as perhaps being true, is that the murder of Philip was masterminded by his wife, Olympias. Now, Philip had just taken another wife, this time a Macedonian girl, not a foreigner. And there was talk at court that Philip would finally produce a pure blood Macedonian child who would be king. Now, if this were true, Alexander would not inherit the throne. So Olympias, according to this story, wanted to make sure her son was the next king of Macedonia and took matters in her own hands and killed Philip. Well, in any case, Philip was indeed dead, and Alexander was the only suitable person to replace him. So Alexander did become king. And Olympias, again, making her seem a bit more suspect in this story, killed the young girl, the new wife of Philip, who was carrying a child, to make sure that Alexander would not have any competition. So a rather unfortunate story, but Alexander does become king and took on a plan that his father had set into motion. Right before Philip's death, he had announced that he had planned to invade the Persian Empire. Now, this was pretty audacious because the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to India and was vast. But there had been a recent coup. The recent king of Persia had been displaced, and there was reason to think that Persia was somewhat in disarray, so it might be a good time to invade. Philip also wanted to unite Greece behind him. He had conquered Greece, but the Greeks weren't happy with it. And so he decided that having a united enemy would help him keep control of the Greeks. He reminded the Greeks that there were Greek cities on the west coast of what is today Turkey, cities like Miletus, that were under Persian control and needed to be liberated. He also reminded them that 150 years earlier, the Persians had burnt Athens, and so there should be revenge. But the most probably important point was that Persia was rich and there was a lot of booty to be had. So right before his death, everybody was excited about the prospect of invading Persia. And so Alexander took on this task. And 2 years later, at the age of 20, he and a vast army of about 100,000 crossed the Hellespont into Persia. Now, the Persian army knew of this and they were waiting for him at a place called Granicus. But interestingly enough, that's not where Alexander went first. He was more interested in his own mythology. So the first thing he did was visit Troy, the site of the Great Trojan War, where his ancestor Achilles fought and died. Alexander saw the great walls that we can still see today, and he visited the tomb of Achilles that has never been discovered. We see an imagined reconstruction of it. Alexander kind of thought about his great ancestor, communed with his spirit, and after about a week, had enough of his trip to Troy and began to engage with the Persians. Now, I'm not going to talk about battle strategy today. There's just very little time, but I will say that Alexander always led He was always in the forefront of fighting, and this battle was no different. He rode with his cavalry into the Persians and was nearly killed. He always was visible because he wore a white plumed helmet, and a Persian soldier, taking advantage and seeing him, nearly sliced him with his sword. But a man named Clytus the Black, who we'll hear more of, an old contemporary of Alexander's father, saved Alexander's life by killing the Persian. While Alexander was victorious in this battle, many of his cavalry did fall, and he set up a statue group in their honor back in Greece. And we see a small copy of Alexander's statue that was in this group, that you see Alexander on Bucephalus fighting in the fray. Now, after the battle, Alexander did something really interesting, and this is something he does always. He went to see his own men. Even though he was slightly wounded, he didn't take care for his own body. He went to visit his wounded soldiers, even the most simple foot soldier he wanted to talk to and share their experiences. And this made him greatly loved, and he truly cared about the well-being of his men and wanted to hear their stories about the battle. Now, the battle was quite important because the cities on the west coast of what is today Turkey immediately went over to them. These cities had Persian governments, they were overthrown, and these cities threw their allegiance to Alexander. A few put up a bit of a fight, but he easily overcame them. And the Persian army, meanwhile, had fled east. Now, once again, Alexander didn't do the expected. The expected thing would have been to chase down that army in its weakened state and defeat it. But Alexander was once again fascinated with a kind of mythology. And in this case, it was a prophecy that surrounded a city called Gordian. And Gordian, you can see, is in the center of what is today Turkey, up in the mountains. Alexander had heard a prophecy that there was a cart with a yoke that was at Gordian, and the yoke was attached to the cart by this knot that could not be untied. If one could untie the knot, they would rule the world. So Alexander certainly couldn't let that prophecy go untested. He took a majority of his army to Gordian to see if he could undo this knot. Now, he saw the walls that you can still see today, and behind the walls was the great Acropolis, today just a green hill, on which stood the temple of Zeus, and next to that temple was the cart with the knot. So Alexander went to the knot, tried to untie it, and simply could not. But rather than let that prophecy go, he pulled out his sword and sliced the knot in half, saying, the prophecy doesn't say how you open the knot, just that the knot got open. Well, that night there was a thunderstorm, and that reflected the approval of the god Zeus. And of course, Alexander did end up ruling the known world. Alexander then turned his sights on the Persian army once again. He traveled south to the city of Tarsus, where he grew ill, and some scholars suggest he may have contracted malaria there. And this is important because that may have been what killed him ultimately. But he recovered after several months and then engaged the army at Issus. Now, here we are lucky enough to have an artifact that's roughly contemporary with this battle. The battle took place in 333 BC. And we have a mosaic that was created in the 1st century BC and is actually from Pompeii, but it's a copy of a painting created in the 4th century. And it shows the moment when the battle is turning. Alexander is on the left, and on the right is Darius III of Persia. Now, he's the king of Persia, and at the Battle of Granicus, Darius hadn't been there. He really didn't think Alexander was enough of a threat. But by now he's very worried, and he is leading the army. He's riding in a chariot. Now, at the moment that we see with this mosaic, the battle is lost for the Persians, and Darius's charioteer is taking his king to safety. He's whipping his horses around, and they are trying to escape. And if you see the intensity of this scene, we can see Alexander staring across the battlefield at Darius, Darius reaching towards Alexander, but he's being taken to safety. So Alexander won the battle. And once again, he was reviewing his troops and talking to them about the battle when he heard weeping, women weeping. And much to his surprise, he discovers that his men had captured the family of Darius III. It was customary for the Persian royalty to bring their women and children to the battlefield. And in the escape of Darius, the family had not been brought. They were just abandoned at the battlefield. So Alexander approached the women. They were worried about Darius. They were worried about their own fate, of course. And Alexander assured them that Darius had escaped and that he would treat them with respect throughout the time that they were in his care. And for what we understand, that was absolutely a true promise. He kept them close by, but they were very well treated and treated with dignity. So after this victory, Alexander needed to capture the areas to the west, including what is the today Syro-Palestine, Phoenicia in antiquity, and Egypt. So he moved south, and it took him a year to pacify Phoenicia. These cities were not happy to be under Macedonian rule, but eventually made it to Egypt. Now, Egypt had been under Persian rule for several centuries, and they had hated being under Persian rule. So when Alexander arrived at the borders of Egypt, the Egyptians welcomed him with open arms. They made him pharaoh, which is king. But it's an important distinction that the king of the Egyptians, the pharaoh, was also believed to be the son of the god Amun and to be a divine being. So Alexander, by becoming pharaoh, was in Egyptian eyes a divine person. Now, Alexander did some interesting things to cement the favor of the Egyptians. He rebuilt many temples that the Persians had damaged. And in several of these temples, we have actual images of Alexander. As you can see on the right, we have Alexander looking very Egyptian indeed, approaching the god Amun, his now father. So Alexander had pacified without any violence Egypt, and Egypt was very much behind him. And so by rights, he should have gone to attack the Persian army. But once again, Alexander was searching for a kind of mythic reality for him. He had heard of a place called Siwa, where there was a temple to Zeus Amun, where the gods Zeus and Amun were combined. It was an oasis deep in the desert, but Alexander wanted to go there because at that temple, you could actually speak to the god in person. It was an oracular temple where you could actually communicate with the god. So Alexander and a few of his men, about 30 of them, moved north to the sea. He founded the city of Alexandria, moved across the coast, and then moved south through the Great Katara Depression. Now, this was a sea of sand that was virtually unpassable, and he and his men got into danger many, many times. They ran out of water, but there was a miraculous rainstorm that provided them with water. They got lost several times. One time, snakes emerged and slithered to show his path. Another time, crows flew in and cawed until they followed these crows. This is what the ancient sources tell us, and the point is that the gods were behind this journey of Alexander's. They supported him. They eventually made it to this remarkable oasis, the true palm oasis, and the Acropolis that is emerging from the trees. This Acropolis had the temple of Zeus, Zeus Amun. Alexander entered the temple. We don't know what he asked, but we do know what he was told. The god told him he was his son, that he was a divine being, that he was the son of God. Now, from an Egyptian perspective, this was perfectly sensible. He was Pharaoh, and that means he was the son of Amun. But for the Greeks, this was odd news. There was one thing about having an ancestor who was divine. It was another thing for Alexander to be divine himself. And this was something that Alexander grappled with throughout his life, and many Greeks and Macedonians were quite resistant to this idea. Now, after Alexander's death, he was thought to be divine. And just to illustrate this, you can see the two coins I've shown you. The one on the bottom is a coin that depicts Zeus Ammon, and he has these pronounced horns, ram horns, that encircle his ear. After Alexander's death, coins were minted showing Alexander, and he too wears these same horns. Well, having taken Egypt and Phoenicia, Alexander once again was in pursuit of the Persian army. He travels quickly through Syria and northern Iraq, engages with the battle with the Persians at a place called Gaugamela, and once again is victorious, and once again the Persians flee. Alexander moves on to Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, which again had suffered under Persian rule. The Babylonians hated the Persians. So Alexander gained their favor by rebuilding temples, including the great ziggurat of Marduk, Marduk, the king of the gods, and deciding that Babylon would be a city that he would return to one day, which indeed he did. From there, he enters Persian territory proper. He visits the city of Susa and then camps at Persepolis. Now, Persepolis was one of the most important cities of the Persian world. It was an important religious center, political center. Alexander was there for over a month. He allowed his troops to pillage the area around the city, but he kept the city safe, living there and enjoying the city himself. At this point, we know he's having many, many wild parties. This was something the Macedonians tended to do. It was a way to kind of unite with his men, but sometimes they got out of hand. And at this one party, Alexander is approached by a woman named Thais. You see her standing before him almost naked in the picture. She was an Athenian and was kind of a camp follower. She was taking advantage of what she could get from the soldiers. And she reminded Alexander that the Persians had burnt Athens, and she said it's time for revenge. Now, the burning had taken place 150 years earlier, but she thought it was time that Persia paid. And she said we should burn Persepolis. And Alexander, in his cups, said, yeah, that seems like a good idea. And so she leads Alexander and his party and sets fire to the city of Persepolis. Now, Alexander later said he regretted this, but of course it was too late. It certainly was a strong message he gave to the Persians that he was in command and he had their fates in his hand. Well, Alexander now controlled most of Persia, everything to the west, but he still could not be considered the king of Persia because the king of Persia still lived. Darius III had fled north with a small army. So Alexander was eager to capture this king so that he could be given the kingdom by Darius. But Alexander was thwarted in this. Darius had fled north to what is today Isfahan, and Darius's second in command murdered him. Now, Alexander caught up with Darius shortly after the murder. Some stories say he got there in time to watch Darius pass away. We don't know what the truth is in here, but we do see stories later of Alexander cradling the head of Darius in his lap, as you see in this 11th century Persian manuscript. With the death of Darius, though, Alexander was truly now the king of Persia, even though Darius's murderer also claimed kingship. Now things change at this point, and not for the better. Alexander moved into really rugged terrain, into what eventually would be known as Afghanistan. And he was pursuing this murderer of Darius. He was also trying to secure territory for himself. But the territory was very forbidding: high mountains, rough terrain, little water, very cold. Alexander's normal fighting technique, which was to line men up with their long sarissas or to use cavalry, was absolutely no good here. He couldn't fight the way he normally did. And so, although he had victories, they were hard to come by. He was plagued by guerrilla warfare, by tribes that knew the terrain much better than he did. And you can see, particularly in the upper right-hand corner of the map, how Alexander was fighting backwards and forwards, very difficult to gain this terrain. And something else was happening during this time. Alexander himself seemed to have been changing. Now he had taken the title of king, and he gained control of much of the Persian Empire. And he began to act like a Persian king. He dressed like a Persian, and he began to follow Persian customs. And this was really hard for many of his men to take. They'd been fighting the Persians, and now Alexander was becoming like a Persian. And one of the hardest things for his men to take was the fact that Alexander began isolating himself the way a Persian king habitually did. Alexander still had his drinking parties, but he was surrounding himself with flatterers, with people who would give him all of the positive feedback he craved. And I'll give you two examples of this that are very unpleasant stories, I'm sorry to say. One was at a party where Alexander was drinking heavily with his men. His flatterers were saying, "Oh, you're the greatest warrior of all time. Nobody has ever been better than you in military, and you're a divine being." Well, there was one man at this party who could not take this story, and that was Clitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life way back at Granicus. Clitus had been a close friend of Alexander's father. And so with all this flattery, Clitus stood up and said, "This is ridiculous. Your father was the better man. He built the army. You just inherited it. You're not half the warrior he was. And how can you be divine? I saved your life." Well, Alexander was incensed. He picked up a spear, threw it across the room, and killed Clitus, the man who had saved his life. Now, the next day, he was sorry, but a little too late. A similar story occurred shortly thereafter, where Alexander began to ask his men to kneel before him. This is an act called proskinesis. And this is not what was typical in a Macedonian court. But for Persians, yes, you knelt before the king. You see a relief carving that comes from Persepolis that shows the king on a throne and a man approaching him, kissing his lips, and about to kneel. Well, Alexander asked that his men do this, and of course his flatterers were happy to do so. But some resented this action because it was really only something you did before the statue of a god. And one of these men was a man named Callisthenes, who was the nephew of Aristotle. And Aristotle had handpicked him to go with Alexander to keep record of what Alexander did. Well, Callisthenes refused to kneel, and a few weeks later, he was accused of treason by Alexander and put to death. So these are unsettling stories of how Alexander was struggling to, I think, for his identity. He wanted to be a king that was recognizable to the Persians, so he needed to act like a Persian king, but he was losing his persona as a Macedonian king, and that was creating hostility with his men. And the trouble was, they were not winning terrain. They were not gaining territory here. They were sort of fighting in circles. So Alexander cleverly took a page out of his father's book and made a diplomatic marriage. He married a woman named Roxana, whose father was the most important chief in the region. Now, legend has it that it was a love match, that she was the most beautiful woman on earth. And if you look at this 16th century painting with all the little cupids, you see that that's the interpretation. But I think Alexander was more sensible. I think he was looking for a way to pacify this area, and making a marriage alliance was a good way to do it, as his father knew. And in fact, after he married Roxana, the area became loyal to him and he was able to move on. He crossed the Indus River, and here he met one of his greatest enemies, an Indian named Porus, the king of the region, with whom he went to battle. And this was a hard battle to win because the Indians had elephants. Alexander and his men had never encountered elephants before. The horses were frightened by the smell. The elephants were terrifying. So Alexander nearly lost this battle. But of course, he persevered, defeated Porus, but was so impressed with Porus, he left the king on his throne and let him keep his terrain, just promise loyalty to Alexander. Now, Alexander was so impressed with this battle himself that he minted a coin that shows him on horseback following elephants. Now, I don't know who the horse was. It might have been Bucephalus. We actually hear that Bucephalus dies out here right after that battle, by now a very old horse. And Bucephalus was buried, and Alexander actually founded a city in Bucephalus's name, Alexandria Bucephala. Well, from this point, Alexander wants to move further east. He's heard of a place called China that's just a few days' march away, and he wants to conquer that. But his men were tired. They were frightened by elephants. They heard there were more elephants farther ahead. It was monsoon season. It was hot and wet. And his men surprisingly said, no, we're not going to go any further with you. You can go to China on your own. We will not follow you anymore. And this is surprising because he had had such a wonderful relationship with his men, but his taking on the trappings of a Persian king had damaged their relationship. Alexander was incensed. He went into his tent for 3 days, sulking, and then came out saying, well, the gods have said I should go home. Kind of a face-saving device. And Alexander began the journey home down the Indus River. Now, this was not an easy task. The tribes along the river were very hostile to Alexander, and he had to fight very hard all the way. In fact, he was almost killed in a battle where he was skewered in the side and a spear pierced his lung. He nearly died. But eventually they made it down to the Arabian Sea. And here Alexander does perhaps one of the most controversial acts in his life. He sends much of his army back west on shipboard through the Persian Gulf. He sends some of his army home via the northern route, but the majority of his army, led by him, went through the Gedrosian desert. Now, this was an intractable land, and perhaps the reason why Alexander chose to go through it was because nobody had done it before. So Alexander and his men went through this desert, and it was a disaster. There was no water, there was no food. Or if there was water, it came in the form of flash floods that washed his troops away. At one point where they were dying of thirst, one of his men found a little bit of water, and he brought it in a helmet to Alexander. And Alexander looked at his troops knowing everybody was thirsty and poured it to the ground, saying, if you can't drink, I won't drink. So again, this love of his troops came through. Well, eventually they made it back west. They made it to the Persian capital of Susa, where Alexander makes it very clear his plans for the future. He marries the daughter of Darius III, so he makes a marriage alliance with the Persian princess, and he asks his highest in command, some 200 men, to take Persian wives as well. He really wants to mesh these two communities. He also elicited 1,000 Persian young men and trained them up to be Macedonian type warriors. Now, once again, this made his own men pretty uncomfortable. They'd been fighting Persia, and now the Persians were joining their ranks. Alexander sent his older troops home, richly rewarded for their efforts, and was hoping that recruits would come from Macedonia and Greece. And Alexander made his way to Babylon, the city that he had promised he would return to, that would be his new capital. Perhaps he marched through the great Ishtar Gate, and there he waited for the Persian boys to be trained, for new recruits to come from the West. He began planning his next move, which he perhaps would invade Saudi Arabia. He'd heard about Rome, maybe he would invade there, but his plans were cut short. In the spring of 323 BCE, he was at a drinking party, drinking heavily, but he grew ill. He developed a high fever, and 10 days later, he died at the age of 33, at the height of his power. We don't know what killed him. He had been wounded many, many times, including on the Indus River when his lung was pierced, so that might have caught up with him. He probably had contracted malaria long ago, and Babylon was also a malarial area. He may have succumbed to malaria or some other disease. There was a rumor that he had been murdered by Aristotle, who had sent poison in retaliation for Alexander's killing of his nephew. Probably not a true story. But as he lay on his deathbed, his men surrounded him and said, "To whom do you leave this vast empire?" Roxana was actually pregnant, but there was no telling the gender of her child, and certainly a little baby was not a fit ruler. So Alexander, shortly before his death, according to legend, when asked who would inherit his kingdom, he said to his men, "Whoever is strongest." And this, unfortunately, was a green light for civil war. And that's precisely what happened. In the 20 years after his death, his generals fought one another, each trying to get a piece of the pie, to get a piece of the empire for themselves. So Alexander's empire didn't hold. But what he left behind him was this fascinating period called the Hellenistic period, where ideas from India and Persia mesh with ideas from Greece. And we see this incredible development in science and art and literature, a truly exciting, life-changing period in the Greek world. So Alexander certainly did change the world in a profound way. Was he great? Well, I hope today I've given you tools to assess that. I think he was certainly very human, and I think he was certainly rather tragic in his attempt to try to be everything to everyone, the Macedonian king, the Persian king. And I think some of his angels kept him safe and kept him powerful, but I think the demons ultimately took him down. Some even suggest that he died of cirrhosis of the liver. We'll never know. But I hope that you can think about this and you can decide on your own whether Alexander was truly a great man, a tragic man, a human like all of us. So thank you very much.